Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Insurgent Mexico. Today, we are starting part 4. That's called A People in Arms. And it starts with chapter 1 on Tutorion. So, yeah, let's take a look here right quick, because I didn't check and see how long. Okay, we'll read the first couple chapters. Anyway, let's jump into this. Chapter 1 on Tutorion. At Yermo, there is nothing but leagues and leagues of sandy desert, sparsely covered with scrubby mesquite and dwarf cactus, stretching away on the west to jagged, tawny mountains, and on the east to a quavering skyline of plain. A battered water tank with too little dirty alkali water, a demolished railway station shot to pieces by Roscoe's cannon 2 years before, and a switch track compose the town. There is no water to speak of for 40 miles. There is no grass for animals. For 3 months, in the spring bitter, parching winds drive the yellow dust across it. Along the single track in the middle of the desert lay 10 enormous trains, pillars of fire by night and of black smoke by day, stretching back northward farther than the eye could reach. Around them in the chaparral camped 9,000 men without shelter, each man's horse tied to the mesquite beside him, where hung this one sarape and red strips of drying meat. From 50 cars, horses and mules were being unloaded. Covered with sweat and dust, a ragged trooper plunged into the cattle car among the flying hoofs, swung himself upon a horse's back, and jabbed his spurs deep in with a yell. Then came a terrific drumming of frightened animals, and suddenly a horse shot violently from the open door, usually backward, and the car belched flying masses of horses and mules. Picking themselves up, they fled in terror, snorting through the wide nostrils at the smell of the open. Then the wide, watchful circle of troopers turned. Vaqueros lifted the great coils of their lasses through the choking dust, and the running animals swirled around and round upon one another in a panic. Officers, orderlies, generals with their staffs, soldiers with their halters, hunting for their mounts, galloped and ran past in inextricable confusion. Bucking mules were being harnessed to the caissons. Troopers who had arrived on the last trains wandered without looking for their brigades. Way ahead, some men were shooting at a rabbit. From the tops of the boxcars and the flat cars, where they were camped by hundreds, the Solidaris and their half-naked swarms of children looked down, screaming shrill advice, and asking everybody in general if they had happened to see where Ron Mofieros or Jesus Hernandez, or whatever the name of their man happened to be. One man, trailing a rifle, wandered along shouting that he had nothing to eat for 2 days and he couldn't find his woman who made his tortillas for him, and he opined that she had deserted him to go with some or of another brigade. The women on the roofs of the car said, "Valgame Dios," and shrugged their shoulders. Then they dropped him down some 3-day-old tortillas and asked him, for the love he bore Our Lady of Guadalupe, to lend them a cigarette. A clamorous, dirty throng stormed the engine of our train, screaming for water. When the engineer stood them off with a revolver, telling them there was plenty of water in the water train, they broke away and aimlessly scattered, while a fresh throng took their places. Around the 12 immense tank cars, a fighting mass of men and animals struggled for place at the little faucets, ceaselessly pouring. Above the place, a mighty cloud of dust, 7 miles long and a mile wide, towered up into the still, hot air, and with the black smoke of the engines struck wonder and terror into the federal outposts 50 miles away on the mountains back of Mapimi. When Villa left Chihuahua for Torreon, he closed the telegraph wires to the north, stopped train service to Juarez, and forbade, on pain of death, that anyone should carry or send news of his departure to the United States. His object was to take the Federals by surprise, and it worked beautifully. No one, not even Villa's staff, knew when he would leave Chihuahua. The army had delayed there so long that we all believed it would delay another 2 weeks. And then Saturday morning we woke to find the telegraph and railway cut in 3 huge trains carrying the Brigada Gonzalez Ortega, already gone. The Zaragoza left the next day, and Villa's own troops the following morning, moving with swiftness that always characterizes him. Villa had his entire army concentrated at Yermo the day afterward, without the Federals knowing that he had left Chihuahua. There was a mob around the portable field telegraph that had been rigged up in the mine station. Inside, the instrument was clicking. Soldiers and officers indiscriminately choked up the windows and the door, and every once in a while the operator would shout something in Spanish and a perfect roar of laughter would go up. It seemed that the telegraph had accidentally tapped a wire that had not been destroyed by the Federals, a wire that connected with the Federal military wire from Mapimi to Torreon. "Listen," cried the operator. "Colonel Argumindo, in command of the Cabecillas Colorados in Mapimi, is telegraphing to General Velasco in Torreon. He says that he sees smoke and a big dust cloud to the north and thinks that some rebel troops are moving south from Escalon." Night came with a cloudy sky and a rising wind that began to lift the dust. Along the miles and miles of trains, the fires of the Solidaras flared from the tops of the freight cars, out into the desert so far that finally they were pinpoints of flame stretched the innumerable campfires of the army, half obscured by the thick billowing dust. The storm completely concealed us from federal watchers. Even God, remarked Major Leva, even God is on the side of Francisco Villa. We sat at the dinner in our converted boxcar with young, great-limbed, expressionless General Maximo Garcia and little Major Manuel Acosta, with the beautiful manners of his race. Garcia had long been holding the advance at Escalon. He and his brothers, one of whom, Jose Garcia, the idol of the army, had been killed in battle, but a short 4 years ago were wealthy haciendos, owners of immense tracts of land. They had come out with Madero. I remember that he brought us a jug of whiskey and refused to discuss the revolution, declaring that he was fighting for better whiskey. As I write this comes a report that he is dead from a bullet wound received in the Battle of Sacramento. Out in the dust storm on a flat car immediately ahead of ours, some soldiers lay around their fire with their heads in women's laps singing The Cockroach, which tells in hundreds of satirical verses that the Constitutionalists would do when they captured Juarez and Chihuahua from Mercado and Orozco. Above the wind, one was aware of the immense sullen murmur of the host, and occasionally some sentry challenged in a falsetto howl, "¿Quién vive?" And the answer, "Chiapas, que gente!" Ciao! Through the night sounded the eerie whistle of 10 locomotives at intervals as they signaled back and forth to one another. Chapter 2, the army at Yermo. At dawn next morning, General Toribio Ortega came to the car for breakfast, a lean, dark Mexican who is called the Honorable and the most brave by his soldiers. He is by far the most simple-hearted and disinterested soldier in Mexico. He never kills his prisoners. He has refused to take a cent from the revolution beyond his meager salary. Villa respects and trusts him perhaps beyond all his generals. Ortega was a poor man and a cowboy. He sat there with his elbows on the table, forgetting his breakfast, his big eyes flashing, smiling his gentle, crooked smile, and told us why he was fighting. "I am not an educated man," he said, "but I know that to fight is the last thing for any people. Only when things get too bad to stand, eh? And if we are going to kill our brothers, something fine must come out of it, eh? You in the United States do not know what we have seen, we Mexicans. We have looked on at the robbing of our people, the simple, the poor people, for 35 years, eh? We have seen the rurales and the soldiers of Porfirio Diaz shoot down our brothers and fathers and justice denied to them. We have seen our little fields taken away from us and all of us sold into slavery, eh? We have longed for our homes and for schools to teach us, and they have laughed at us. All we have ever wanted was to be let alone to live and to work and make our country great, and we are tired and sick of being cheated. Outside in the dust that whirled along under the sky of driving clouds, long lines of soldiers on horseback stood in the obscurity, while their officers passed along in front, peering closely at cartridge belts and rifles. "Geronimo," said a captain to one trooper, "go back to your the ammunition train and fill up the gaps in your cartuchera. You fool, you've been wasting your cartridges shooting coyotes." Across the desert, westward toward the distant mountains, rode strings of cavalry, the first to the front. About 1,000 went in different lines, diverging like wheel spokes, the jingle of their spurs ringing, their red, white, and green flags floating straight out, crossed bandoliers gleaming dully, rifles flopping across their saddles, heavy, high sombreros and many-colored blankets. Behind each company plodded 10 or 12 women on foot, carrying cooking utensils on their heads and backs, and perhaps a pack mule shaded with sacks of corn. And as they passed the cars, they shouted back to their friends on the trains. "Poco tiempo, California," cried one. "Oh, there's a Colorado for you," yelled another. "I'll bet you were with Salazar in Orozco's revolution." Nobody ever said "Poco tiempo, California," except Salazar when he was drunk. The other man looked sheepish. "Well, maybe I was," he admitted, "but wait till I get a shot at my old compañeros. I'll show you whether I'm a Maderista or not." A little Indian in the rear cried, "I know how much of a Maderista you are, Luisito. At the first taking of Torreon, Villa gave you a choice of turning your coat or getting a cabronazo or balazo through the head." And joshing and singing, they jogged southwest, became small, and finally faded into the dust. Villa himself stood leaning against a car, hands in his pockets. He wore no slouch hat, a dirty shirt without a collar, and a badly frayed and shiny brown suit. All over the dusty plain in front of him, men and horses had sprung up like magic. There was an immense confusion of saddling and bridling, a cracked blowing of 10 bugles. The Brigada Zaragoza was getting ready to leave camp. A flanking column of 2,000 men who were to ride southeast and attack Tlahualilo and Sacramento. Villa, it seemed, had just arrived in Yermo. He had stopped off Monday night at Camargo to attend the wedding of a compadre. His face was drawn into lines of fatigue. "Caramba," he was saying with a grin. "We started dancing Monday evening, danced all night, all the next day, and last night too. What a baile! And what muchachas! The girls of Camargo and Santa Rosalia are the most beautiful in Mexico. I am worn out. Rendido. It was harder work than 20 battles." Then he listened to the report of some staff officer who dashed up on horseback, gave a concise order without hesitating, and the officer strode off. He told Senor Calzado, general manager of the railroad, in what order the train should proceed south. He indicated to Senor Uro, the quartermaster general, what supplies should be distributed from the troop trains. To Senor Munoz, director of the telegraph, he gave the name of a federal captain surrounded by Urbina's men a week before and killed with all his men in the hills near La Cadena, and ordered him to tap the federal wire and send a message to General Velasco in Torreon, purporting to be a report from his captain from Conejos and asking for orders. He seemed to know and order everything. He had lunch with General Eugenio Aguirre Benavides, the quiet, cross-eyed little commander of the Zaragoza Brigade, a member of one of the cultivated Mexican families that gathered around Madero in the First Revolution, with Raul Madero, brother of the murdered president, second in command of the brigade, who was a graduate of an American university and looks like a Wall Street bond salesman, with Colonel Guerra, who went through Cornell, and Major Leyva, Ortega's nephew, a historic fullback on the Notre Dame football team. In the great circle, ready for action, the artillery was parked, with caissons open and mules corralled in the center. Colonel Servin, commander of the guns, sat perched high up on an immense bay horse, a ridiculous tiny figure not more than 5 feet tall. He was waving his hand and shouting a greeting across to General Angeles Carranza's Secretary of War, a giant gaunt man, bareheaded in a brown sweater, with a war map of Mexico hanging from his shoulder, who straddled a small burro. In the thick dust clouds, sweating men labored. The 5 American artillerymen had squatted down in the lee of a cannon, smoking. They held me with a shout. "Say, Bo! What the hell did we ever get into? What in the hell did we ever get into this mess for? Nothing to eat since last night. Worked 12 hours. Say, take our pictures, will you?" There passed by with a friendly nod the little Cockney soldier that had served with Kitchener, and then the Canadian captain, Treston, bawling for his interpreter so that he could give his men some orders about the machine guns, and Captain Marinelli, the fat Italian soldier of fortune, pouring an interminable and intelligible mixture of French, Spanish, and Italian into the ear of a bored Mexican officer. Fierro rode by, cruelly rowling his horse with the bloody mouth. Fierro, the handsome, cruel, and insolent, the butcher they called him, because he killed defenseless prisoners with his revolver and shot down his own men without provocation. Late in the afternoon, the Brigada Zaragoza rode away southeast over the desert, and another night came down. The wind rose steadily in the darkness, growing colder and colder, looking up at the sky, which had been ablaze with polished stars. I saw that all was dark with cloud. Through the roaring whirls of dust, 1,000 thin lines of sparks from the fires streamed southward. The coaling of the engine's fireboxes made sudden glares along the miles of trains. At first we thought we heard the sound of big guns in the distance, but all at once, unexpectedly, the sky split dazzlingly open from horizon to horizon, and thunder fell like a blow, and the rain came level and thick as a flood. For a moment, the human hum of the army was silenced. All the fires disappeared at once, and then came a vast shout of anger and laughter and discomfiture from the soldiers out on the plain, and the most amazing wail of misery from the woman that I have ever heard. The two sounds only lasted a minute. The men wrapped themselves in their serapes and sank down in the shelter of the chaparral, and the hundreds of women and children exposed to the cold and the rain on the flat cars and the tops of the box cars silently and with Indian stoicism settled down to wait for dawn. In General Monclovio Herrera's car ahead was drunken laughter and singing to a guitar. Daybreak came with a sound of all the bugles in the world blowing, and looking out of the car door I saw the desert for miles, bowling with armed men saddling and mounting. A hot sun popped over the western mountains, burning in a clear sky. For a moment, the ground poured up a billowing stream, and then there was dust again, and a thirsty land. There might never have been rain. 100 breakfast fires smoked from the car tops, and the women stood turning their dresses slowly in the sun, chattering and joking. Hundreds of little naked babies danced around while their mothers lifted up their little clothes to the heat. 1,000 joyous troopers shouted to each other that the advance was beginning. Away off to the left, some regiment had given way to joy and was shooting into the air. 6 more long trains had come in during the night, and all the engines were whistling signals. I went forward to get on the first train out, and I passed the car of Trinidad Rodriguez. A harsh feminine voice cried, "Hey kid, come in and get some breakfast." Leaning out of the door were Beatrice and Carmen, 2 noted Juarez women who had been brought to the front by the Rodriguez brothers. I went in and sat down at the table with about 12 men, several of them doctors in the hospital train, 1 French artillery captain, and an assortment of Mexican officers and privates. It was an ordinary freight boxcar like all the private cars, with windows cut in the walls and partitions built to shut out the Chinese cook in the kitchen, and bunks arranged across sides and end. Breakfast consisted of heaping platters of red meat with chili, bowls of frijoles, stacks of cold flour tortillas, and 6 bottles of Monopole champagne. Carmen's complexion was bad, and she was a little stupid from the gastronomic combination, but Beatrice's white, colorless face and red hair, cut Buster Brown fashion, fairly radiated a sort of malicious glee. She was a Mexican, but talked tenderloin English without an accent. Jumping up from the table, she danced around it, pulling the men's hair. "Hello, you damned gringo," she laughed at me. "What are you doing here? You're going to get a bullet in you if you don't get careful." A morose young Mexican, already a little drunk, snapped at her furiously in Spanish. "Don't you talk to him. Do you understand? I'll tell Trinidad how you asked the gringo in to breakfast, and he'll have you shot." Beatrice threw back her head and roared. Did you hear what he said? He thinks he owns me because he once stayed with me in Juarez. My God, she went on, how funny it seems to travel on the railroad and not have to buy a ticket. Look here, Beatrice, I asked her. We may not have such an easy time of it down there. What will you do if we get licked? Who, me? She cried. Why, I guess it won't take me long to get friends in the Federal Army. I'm a good mixer. What is she saying? What do you say? Asked the others in Spanish. With the most perfect insolence, Beatrice translated for them, and in the midst of the uproar that followed, I left. So yeah, that will end this episode. That ends the first couple chapters. But yeah. Considering how women are more or less treated at this point of time, and that it's a war, it's like, you can understand why many of the guys are kind of annoyed and flummoxed, because it's like, hey, wait a minute. So yeah, but we become a part of another group that's traveling as we make our way back north, east, west. I'm not sure which direction they're going in. But yeah. So was Beatrice the senorita who had to stay with our reporter one night because she was scared of spending the night with oh, that's Elizabeta. That's not the same person, so no. Okay. So it's just a bunch of friendly banter kind of back and forth. And she has no problem saying what she wants to say. Even though, like I said, there's some guys who are like, really? Really? Seriously, woman. But yeah. But I guess she had apparently spent some time with that one already partially drunk soldier during that breakfast at one point in time. But she has no problem pushing back. She's like, oh, how it is to ride a train without paying for a ticket. You know, she's got a little bit of bite to her. But yeah. It's, we get a good look at our reporter and soldiers traveling along. And even scaring the the federales a bit. So yeah, because they saw the smoke and fire and they're like, oh goodness, we need to be careful. Because they're expecting something totally different than what's actually happening. Oh, the time of war. Before all the censors and everything, you had to send out actual scouts to find things out and get information for you. So yeah. But we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself. Think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.